Listen closely, friends, for what I'm about to tell you happened to me just 3 months ago, and I swear on my mother's grave that every word is true. I was aboard the research vessel, Deep Explorer, cutting through the black Atlantic waters on a night when the wind howled like the voices of the damned. The coordinates on my GPS read 41°46' N, 49°57'W, the exact spot where the Titanic met her watery grave 112 years ago. As the ship's oceanographer, I thought I was there for science, but I was wrong. Something had been calling me to those cursed waters, something that had been waiting patiently in the depths for over a century. The first sign that this wasn't going to be an ordinary research mission came when our instruments began screaming with interference. The sonar equipment, which had been working perfectly all day, suddenly started picking up impossible readings. Through the static and electronic squealing, I heard it. The faint but unmistakable sound of an orchestra playing "Nearer, My God, to Thee." My blood turned to ice as I realized what I was hearing. The same hymn that Wallace Hartley and his band played as the great ship slipped beneath the waves in 1912 was now drifting up from the depths, as clear as if the musicians were standing right beside me on the deck. I rushed to the sonar station, my hands shaking as I adjusted the controls, desperately trying to rationalize what I was experiencing. The readings showed something massive moving 3,000 feet below us, something the size of an ocean liner. But that was impossible. The Titanic had been resting broken and motionless on the seafloor for generations. Yet there it was on my screen, a ghostly echo pulsing through the dark water, as if the ship itself was trying to rise from its grave. The haunting melody grew louder, joined now by voices, hundreds of voices singing in perfect ethereal harmony. As I stood there, transfixed by the impossible readings, the temperature around me dropped so suddenly that my breath formed clouds in the air. The other crew members had gone below deck, leaving me alone with the singing dead. I could feel them watching me from the depths, reaching up through miles of dark water with spectral fingers, trying to pull me down to join their eternal voyage. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of something that shouldn't exist, the smell of a grand ballroom filled with flowers and perfume, mixed with the metallic tang of seawater and the musty odor of old waterlogged wood. That night, as I lay in my narrow bunk listening to the waves crash against the hull, I began to understand that our expedition wasn't just about exploring the wreckage of history's most famous ship. We had disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed, awakened spirits that had been waiting in the crushing darkness for someone to finally hear their story. The Titanic hadn't simply sunk. It had been murdered, and the souls aboard were crying out for justice. As sleep finally took me, I heard children's laughter echoing through the ship's corridors, and a woman's voice whispering urgently in my ear, "Find the truth, Sarah. Find the truth before it's too late." The next morning brought no relief from the terror of the previous night. I stumbled into the ship's laboratory, my eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, only to find my assistant James standing pale as death before the underwater camera monitors. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely hold his coffee cup, and when he saw me enter, he grabbed my arm with desperate fingers. "Dr. Morrison," he whispered, his voice cracking like a teenage boy's. "You need to see what the cameras picked up during the night. I've been watching this footage for 3 hours and I can't explain what I'm seeing." The monitors flickered with grainy underwater images, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I felt my knees buckle beneath me. There, on the screen, was the Titanic as she had never been seen before. Not broken and scattered across the ocean floor, but somehow whole and teeming with ghostly life. Translucent figures in Edwardian dress wandered through the flooded corridors as if they were strolling through Hyde Park on a Sunday afternoon. In the grand ballroom, I watched in stunned silence as an entire orchestra of spectral musicians played their instruments, their bow strokes producing no bubbles in the water, their fingers moving across keys that should have been destroyed by pressure and time decades ago. Children in nightgowns ran laughing through the first-class dining room, their feet making no sound on the waterlogged carpets, while elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen waltzed to music I could somehow hear through the camera's audio feed. But it was the woman in white who made my blood freeze in my veins. She stood at the ship's rail, her long dress flowing like seaweed in the current, staring directly into the camera with eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. I had read about her in the survivor accounts. Margaret Hayes, the mysterious passenger who had been seen running through the corridors on that fateful night, clutching something precious to her chest. The legends called her the Lady in White, said to be the most frequently spotted ghost among the Titanic's spectral passengers. As I watched, transfixed, she began to move her lips, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. They knew, she was saying. They all knew we were going to die. James leaned closer to the monitor, his breath fogging the screen as he pointed to something in the background. "Look there, behind her," he whispered. "Do you see them?" And then I did. Dark figures lurking in the shadows of the ship's superstructure. Men in black suits who seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They weren't passengers or crew members. They were something else entirely, something that had no business being aboard a passenger liner in 1912. These shadow men watched the ghostly proceedings with the cold detachment of undertakers, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized they were watching us too, their faceless heads turned toward our cameras with malevolent interest. The audio crackled with static, and through the electronic noise came a sound that made my soul shrivel. The voices of the dead, hundreds of them, all speaking at once in a cacophony of despair and rage. But gradually, one voice rose above the others, a cultured British accent that I recognized from historical recordings as Captain Edward Smith himself. The ship was doomed before she ever left port. His spectral voice echoed through our speakers, each word dripping with bitter regret. They made certain of that. The ice was merely their instrument. The real murder was planned in boardrooms and sealed with handshakes and blood money. As the captain's voice faded, the footage cut to black, leaving James and me staring at our own pale reflections in the dark monitors, knowing that we had just witnessed something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. Sleep became impossible after what we had witnessed, so I spent the pre-dawn hours poring over survivor testimonies in my cramped cabin, the ship's generators humming like mechanical prayers in the darkness below. The yellowed pages of historical accounts spread across my desk told stories I had never paid attention to before, stories that now seemed to pulse with sinister significance. Elizabeth Hart, a second-class passenger who survived the sinking, had written in her diary about men in dark suits who boarded at Queenstown but appeared on no passenger manifest. She described how they moved through the ship like shadows, observing everything but speaking to no one, their presence filling her with an inexplicable dread that grew stronger each day of the voyage. As the first pale light of dawn crept through my porthole, I became aware of a presence behind me, a coldness that seemed to seep through the metal walls of the ship itself. When I turned around, my breath caught in my throat like broken glass. Standing at the foot of my narrow bed was a man in an immaculate evening suit, his hair perfectly pomaded despite being soaking wet, a violin case clutched in his pale hands. I knew his face from the photographs, Wallace Hartley, the bandmaster who had played until the very end as the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves. Water dripped steadily from his clothes onto my cabin floor, each drop echoing like a funeral bell in the confined space. "Miss Morrison," he said, and his voice was like wind through a broken organ, beautiful and terrible at the same time. The music never stopped, you know. We've been playing the same songs for over a century, waiting for someone to hear not just the melody, but the truth hidden in the notes. He opened his violin case with movements that seemed to disturb the very air around him, revealing an instrument that gleamed with an otherworldly light. As he lifted the bow to the strings, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Dozens of them, the sound of dress shoes and heeled boots walking in perfect synchronization. "They're all here," Hartley whispered, his eyes reflecting depths that had never seen sunlight. "Every soul who perished that night, and we all have the same message for you." The cabin door, which I was certain I had locked, swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to come from the ship's very bones. Through the doorway came a procession that defied every law of physics and reason. Passengers and crew members from the Titanic, their period clothing waterlogged and clinging to bodies that seemed more memory than flesh. First-class ladies in elaborate gowns walked beside steerage passengers in simple work clothes, their social divisions meaningless now in death. Children held the hands of grandparents they had never known in life, while ship's officers stood at attention beside the coal-blackened stokers who had died trying to keep the power running as the great vessel took her final plunge. They filled my tiny cabin impossibly, dozens of spirits occupying the same space without crowding, their translucent forms overlapping like double-exposed photographs. An elderly woman in a pearl necklace stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "My dear, I am Mrs. Strauss, and I speak for all of us when I say that what happened to our ship was no accident. The men in black, the ones your cameras saw, they were there that night, ensuring that certain passengers never reached New York, that certain cargo never saw American shores. They orchestrated every detail, from the speed we maintained despite the ice warnings to the insufficient number of lifeboats. We are not here to frighten you, child. We are here because you are our last hope for justice." As she spoke, Hartley drew his bow across the strings, and the haunting melody that emerged seemed to carry the weight of every life lost in those frigid waters, a song of sorrow that demanded to be heard by the living world above. The spirits faded with the rising sun, leaving me alone with the echo of their words and the lingering scent of roses and seawater that seemed to cling to every surface in my cabin. I tried to convince myself it had all been a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress, but when I opened my laptop to review the night's data, I found files that hadn't been there before. Audio recordings of children's voices, clear as crystal, singing lullabies in languages that predated the Titanic by centuries. The timestamps showed they had been recorded while I slept, captured by microphones that had been turned off. As I listened, paralyzed with fascination and terror, I heard a little girl's voice rise above the others. "Mama, the water is coming up through the floor again. Why won't anyone help us get home?" That evening, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon like bruises against the darkening sky, I made my way to the ship's dive chamber, drawn by sounds that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The patter of small feet running through corridors, the whispered conversations of children who should have been sleeping peacefully in their beds decades ago. The underwater cameras had been recording continuously, and what I saw on the monitors made my hands shake so violently I could barely operate the controls. Deep in the Titanic's wreckage, in what had once been the third-class family quarters, spectral children moved through the flooded rooms with purpose that chilled my blood. They were building something down there in the crushing darkness, their small hands moving with impossible coordination as they gathered pieces of debris, fragments of their former lives, arranging them into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Little Lorraine Allison, who had perished at just 2 years old, floated near what remained of a first-class stateroom, her tiny fingers pressing against the camera lens as if she could reach through the miles of black water to touch my face. When she opened her mouth to speak, bubbles of light instead of air emerged, carrying her voice through the depths. The bad men made the water angry. They put something in the ship's belly that made it hungry for children. We've been trying to fix it, but we need help from someone who still breathes. As if summoned by her words, more phantom children appeared on the screens. Dozens of them, ranging in age from infants to teenagers, all wearing the clothes they had died in over a century ago. They moved through the wreckage with the eerie grace of swimmers who had learned to navigate an aquatic world where up and down had lost all meaning. I watched in horrified fascination as they formed a circle around something hidden in the ship's lower decks, their young voices joining together in a chant that made the research vessel's hull vibrate with sympathetic resonance. The words were in no language I recognized, yet somehow I understood their meaning. They were trying to contain something, to keep a terrible force from escaping the Titanic's grave. The audio feed crackled with interference, and through the static came the voice of a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. "They're coming back, lady, the shadow men. They know you're listening to us now, and they're angry. They put the hungry thing in our ship's belly, and now it wants to eat more children. You have to warn the other boats. Tell them not to sail over our grave when the moon is dark." As his words faded, the camera feeds went black one by one, but not before I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart stop. Adult figures in those same dark suits moving through the wreckage toward the children, their movements predatory and purposeful. In that moment, I realized with dawning horror that whatever had caused the Titanic disaster was not a relic of the past, but an ongoing threat that used the ship's wreckage as a base of operations, waiting for new victims to sail into its trap. Desperation drove me to break into the ship's classified archives that night, my fingers flying across computer keyboards as I searched for any connection between our expedition and the forces that had begun to reveal themselves. What I found in those encrypted files made my blood run cold. Documents that should never have existed, bearing the seals of insurance companies, maritime authorities, and organizations whose names I didn't recognize, but whose symbols filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. The Titanic hadn't been carrying just wealthy passengers and their belongings. Hidden in her deepest cargo holds was a collection of artifacts so dangerous that certain people would commit mass murder to ensure they never reached their destination. The papers spoke of objects recovered from archaeological sites around the world. Sumerian tablets covered in cuneiform warnings, Egyptian canopic jars that hummed with their own internal energy, Celtic stone circles that had been dismantled and shipped piece by piece to avoid detection. But it was the manifest for cargo hold number 7 that made my hands tremble so violently I could barely read the screen. Listed there, in careful bureaucratic language, was something called the Bathysphere Collection, artifacts allegedly recovered from oceanic trenches so deep that no light had ever touched them. Objects that were described as being of non-terrestrial origin and requiring extreme containment protocols during transport. James burst into the archive room without knocking, his face pale as death and his eyes wide with terror. "Dr. Morrison!" he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "The radiation detectors are going insane. There's something down there in the wreckage that's putting out energy readings unlike anything I've ever seen. And the water temperature, it's dropping so fast that ice is starting to form on the surface, just like..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. "Just like the night the Titanic sank." I followed him to the monitoring station, where every instrument on the research vessel was screaming warnings that chilled me to the bone. The ocean around us was transforming into something that defied natural law, the temperature plummeting while strange currents carved patterns in the water that looked disturbingly like ritual symbols. Through the chaos of alarms and flashing emergency lights, I heard a voice that I had hoped never to encounter, a man's cultured accent speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Dr. Morrison," the voice echoed through our communication system, though no one had opened a channel. "You have been remarkably persistent in your investigations. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Mordecai Blackwood, and I was a passenger aboard the Titanic, though you won't find my name on any official roster. I was there to ensure that certain cargo never reached American shores, and I succeeded admirably. Unfortunately, my success came at the cost of being trapped in this aquatic purgatory for over a century, but that situation is about to change." As Blackwood's disembodied laughter filled the air around us, our underwater cameras activated of their own accord, showing us something that made my sanity teeter on the edge of collapse. Deep in the Titanic's flooded hull, in a chamber that should have been crushed by the immense pressure, stood a figure in an impeccably tailored black suit, apparently breathing water as easily as air. Behind him, arranged in careful rows like soldiers awaiting orders, were dozens of the shadow men I had seen in previous footage, their faceless heads all turned toward our cameras with predatory attention. "The cargo I was sent to destroy has been feeding on the souls of the dead for more than a century," Blackwood continued, his voice now seeming to come from inside my own skull. "Soon it will be strong enough to surface, and when it does, every ship that sails these waters will join the Titanic in her eternal voyage to the bottom of the sea." What happened next defied every law of physics I had ever studied, every rational explanation my scientific mind tried to construct. The ocean around our research vessel began to freeze, not gradually, as one might expect in polar waters, but instantaneously, as if some cosmic hand had reached down from the heavens and decided that this patch of the Atlantic should become a mirror of that terrible night in April 1912. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, a deep, resonant cracking that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, followed by the crystalline singing of ice, forming so rapidly that it released its own harmonic frequency. Within minutes, we were surrounded by jagged bergs that towered above our ship like the frozen cathedral spires of some underwater deity. James ran onto the deck, his breath forming clouds so thick they obscured his face, and pointed with a shaking hand toward the port side of our vessel. "My God," he whispered, his words barely audible above the supernatural symphony of freezing water. "Look at them." Rising from the depths like some hellish elevator, the spirits of the Titanic's passengers began to emerge from the ice itself, their forms more solid and terrifying than I had ever seen them before. They climbed up through the frozen surface as if it were nothing more than morning mist, their period clothing now tattered and stained with substances that looked far too much like blood to be seaweed or rust. But it was their faces that made my heart hammer against my ribs, expressions of rage and desperation so intense that looking at them directly felt like staring into the sun. Margaret Hayes, the lady in white, was the first to reach our deck, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the metal surface as she approached me with purpose that burned in her spectral eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent over a century rehearsing the words she was about to say. "Sarah Morrison, descendant of the Hayes bloodline, you have been chosen not by accident, but by design. The artifacts in the ship's belly, they can only be destroyed by someone who shares the blood of those who died trying to stop Blackwood's ritual. Your great-great-grandmother was my sister, and she died that night trying to warn the other passengers about what was coming. Now it falls to you to finish what she started." As Margaret spoke, the frozen ocean around us began to crack and heave, revealing glimpses of something vast and tentacled moving beneath the ice. The temperature continued to drop until the very air seemed to crystallize, and through the supernatural cold came sounds that no human throat could produce: the groaning of metal under impossible pressure, the whispers of languages that predated human civilization, and underneath it all, the steady rhythm of something immense breathing in the depths below us. Captain Smith materialized beside Margaret, his uniform now bearing the stains of his century-long vigil in the abyss. And when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "The ritual is beginning, Miss Morrison. Every 112 years, when the stars align as they did on the night we sank, Blackwood attempts to complete his work. Tonight is that night, and if he succeeds, every ship on every ocean will become a feeding ground for the entities he serves." The ice beneath our feet began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light, and through the translucent surface, I could see shapes moving. Not the familiar forms of the Titanic's ghosts, but things that belonged to no earthly taxonomy. They writhed and coiled through the frozen water like living nightmares, their movements creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Geometric forms that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process. "Look there," Margaret said, pointing toward the horizon where a fleet of modern cruise ships was approaching our coordinates, their lights twinkling like stars against the dark sky. 3,000 innocent souls sailing directly into Blackwood's trap, just as we did all those years ago. The children you saw in the wreckage, they've been trying to contain the entities for over a century, but their strength is failing. If those ships reach these waters before midnight, everyone aboard will join us in our eternal vigil in the depths. What I'm about to tell you next will sound like the ravings of a madwoman, but I swear by everything holy that I witnessed it with my own eyes. The ice around our ship began to crack in perfect geometric patterns, forming a massive ritual circle that stretched for miles across the frozen ocean. At each intersection of the lines, geysers of superheated water erupted skyward, carrying with them artifacts that should have been buried forever beneath thousands of tons of sediment and crushing pressure. Ancient stone tablets covered in cuneiform script that seemed to writhe and change even as I watched. Obsidian sculptures of creatures that violated every principle of evolutionary biology, and crystalline formations that hummed with their own malevolent energy, all rising from the depths like offerings to some unspeakable deity. James grabbed my arm so tightly I could feel his fingernails digging through my jacket, his voice cracking with terror as he pointed toward the center of the ritual circle. "Dr. Morrison, look at the Titanic!" And there, impossibly, the great ship was rising from her grave, not as the broken wreck I had studied for years, but as she had appeared on that final night, whole, magnificent, and absolutely terrifying. Her lights blazed against the darkness, her smokestacks belched black smoke into the star-filled sky, and from her decks came the sound of an orchestra playing that same haunting melody that had first drawn me to these cursed waters. But this was no joyful resurrection. The ship moved with the jerky, unnatural motion of a marionette controlled by invisible strings, and the figures visible on her decks were not the elegant passengers of 1912, but the shadow men in their endless rows, standing at attention like soldiers awaiting orders from their commander. In the ship's grand ballroom, visible through windows that glowed with spectral fire, I could see Mordecai Blackwood conducting what could only be described as a black mass. He stood at the center of a circle formed by the artifacts that had been hauled up from the ocean floor, his arms raised toward the sky as he chanted in a language that predated human civilization. Around him, the shadow men swayed in perfect unison, their movements creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to pull at something deep within my soul. But it was what surrounded them that made my sanity crack like thin ice. Dozens of children's souls, the spirits of every young passenger who had perished in 1912, trapped within crystalline cages that pulsed with the same sickly light I had seen in the depths. Margaret Hayes appeared beside me, her form now solid enough to place a freezing hand on my shoulder, her voice urgent with the weight of centuries of waiting. "The children are the key," she whispered, her words creating small clouds of vapor in the supernatural cold. "Their innocence is what powers the containment ritual, but Blackwood is using their own energy to feed the entities he serves. If he completes the summoning, those creatures will have enough strength to break free of this oceanic prison and spread across every body of water on Earth. The ritual can only be stopped by someone of Hayes' blood touching the primary artifact, the obsidian heart that he's using as a focus for the summoning." As if he had heard her words across the miles of frozen water, Blackwood turned toward our ship, his face visible through the Titanic's ballroom windows with perfect clarity despite the impossible distance. When he smiled, I saw that his teeth had been replaced with sharp obsidian points, and his eyes burned with a light that belonged to no earthly fire. "Miss Morrison?" His voice echoed across the ritual circle, carried by winds that seemed to blow from every direction at once. "You are welcome to try to stop me, but know that you will be attempting to undo work that has been over a millennium in the making. The entities I serve have been patient beyond human comprehension, but their hunger has grown vast during their imprisonment. Come to me, descendant of those who failed before you, and let us see if your bloodline can finally break the chains that bind these ancient gods to their watery tomb." The moment I made the decision to descend into those cursed depths, every rational part of my mind screamed in protest, but I knew with the certainty that comes only in nightmares that I had no choice. James helped me into the research submersible, his hands shaking so violently he could barely operate the controls, while above us, the ghostly passengers of the Titanic lined the rails of our ship like an honor guard of the damned. As we descended through the frozen water, the pressure gauges went haywire, showing readings that should have crushed our tiny vessel like an eggshell. Yet somehow we continued downward, protected by forces I dared not contemplate. The water around us was no longer the familiar blue-black of the deep ocean, but had taken on a sickly luminescence that reminded me of infected wounds, and swimming through it were shapes that my mind refused to process as anything other than living nightmares. The Titanic loomed before us as we approached, not the rusted wreck I had studied in countless photographs, but a ship that seemed to exist in multiple states of decay and restoration simultaneously. In some sections, she appeared exactly as she had on that fateful night in 1912, her paint gleaming and her brass fixtures polished to mirror brightness, while in others, she showed the ravages of her century beneath the waves, her hull twisted and broken like the bones of some massive sea creature. The contradiction hurt to look at directly, as if my eyes were trying to process two different realities occupying the same space. Through the porthole of our submersible, I could hear the sound of the ship's orchestra playing, but the melody was wrong. The same notes I had heard so many times before, but played in reverse, creating a tune that seemed to pull at something fundamental in my soul. We docked at what had once been the ship's loading bay, now transformed into something that belonged in no earthly vessel. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, carved deep into metal that should have been corroded beyond recognition, but instead gleamed with that same unhealthy phosphorescence I had seen in the water above. James remained in the submersible, his face pale as death as he monitored my progress through the communication system, while I made my way through corridors that defied every law of physics and architecture. Doors opened onto rooms that were larger inside than outside, staircases led both up and down simultaneously, and everywhere I looked, the shadow men stood in perfect formation, their eyeless faces following my movement with predatory attention. In what had once been the ship's cargo hold, I found the source of the horror that had been growing in these depths for over a century. The artifacts that Blackwood had been transporting were arranged in a perfect circle around something that my mind struggled to comprehend. A pulsing organic mass that seemed to be part machine, part creature, and part geometric impossibility. Tentacles thick as tree trunks emerged from its central bulk, reaching toward crystalline cages that contained the spirits of the Titanic's child passengers, their innocent souls providing the energy needed to keep this thing alive and growing. But it was the thing's eyes, dozens of them, each the size of a dinner plate and filled with an intelligence that was ancient beyond measure, that finally shattered what remained of my sanity. Blackwood stood before this abomination like a priest before his altar, his century of imprisonment having transformed him into something that was no longer entirely human. His skin had taken on the same phosphorescent quality as the water around us, and when he turned to greet me, I saw that his transformation had gone far deeper than mere physical change. "Welcome to the heart of my great work, Miss Morrison," he said, his voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "What you see before you is one of the old ones, entities that ruled this world long before your species crawled from the primordial ooze. It has been feeding on human souls for over a century, growing stronger with each passing year, and tonight it will finally have enough power to call its brethren from the depths of space. The Titanic was never meant to reach New York. She was always intended to be a sacrifice, a way to anchor one of these beings to your reality. And now, thanks to your arrival, the ritual can finally be completed." As Blackwood's words echoed through the impossible geometry of the cargo hold, the entity at the center of the ritual circle began to pulse with increasing intensity, its massive form expanding and contracting like a cosmic heart-pumping darkness through the veins of reality itself. I could feel its alien consciousness pressing against my mind, trying to crack open my sanity like a walnut to feast on the soft meat of human thought within. The children's souls trapped in their crystalline prisons began to scream, not with their voices, for they had none, but with a psychic agony that made my ears bleed and my vision blur with tears of pure terror. "You feel it, don't you?" Blackwood whispered, his transformed features twisting into something that might have been a smile if it had belonged to anything remotely human. "The weight of cosmic truth pressing down upon your fragile mortal mind. This being has been dreaming in the depths for millions of years, and in its dreams, it has seen the future. A world where humanity serves as cattle for entities that treat your entire species as nothing more than a renewable food source. The Titanic was just the beginning, Miss Morrison. Every maritime disaster, every unexplained disappearance at sea, every ship that has vanished without a trace, they have all been feeding this creature, preparing it for the moment when it would finally have enough power to signal its brethren among the stars. The water around us began to boil despite the crushing pressure, and through the superheated chaos swam things that had never been born in any earthly ocean. Creatures with too many eyes and not enough bones, jellyfish that pulsed with their own malevolent intelligence, and schools of fish whose scales reflected images of distant galaxies where beings like the one before me ruled over worlds that had forgotten the meaning of hope. I reached for the diving knife at my belt, knowing it was pathetically inadequate against cosmic horror, but Margaret Hayes materialized beside me, her ghostly hand closing over mine with surprising strength. "Not steel, child," she whispered urgently, her form flickering between the elegant lady she had been in life and the waterlogged specter she had become in death. "The knife your great-great-grandmother carried, the one passed down through generations of Hayes women. It's in your equipment bag, blessed by priests who knew the truth about what sailed aboard our ship that night. But you must understand, using it will bind you to us forever. Strike the obsidian heart at the creature's center, and you will save the world above, but you will never see sunlight again." I fumbled through my gear with trembling fingers until I found it. A simple silver blade that had somehow made its way into my equipment without my knowledge, inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The moment my skin touched the metal, visions flooded my mind. My ancestor Sarah Hayes fighting desperately through the Titanic's flooding corridors, trying to reach this very cargo hold before the ship sank, knowing she would die in the attempt, but determined to stop Blackwood's ritual, even if it cost her everything. She had failed that night, dragged down by the freezing water before she could reach her target, but her sacrifice had weakened the binding ritual enough to keep the entity dormant for over a century. As I raised the blessed blade, every shadow man in the cargo hold turned toward me with predatory focus, their eyeless faces somehow conveying an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. Blackwood laughed, a sound like grinding ice mixed with dying screams, and gestured toward the entity at the ritual's center. "Do you truly believe that one mortal woman with a kitchen knife can undo work that has taken me lifetimes to complete? Even if you somehow manage to damage the obsidian heart, there are dozens of other ships sailing toward these coordinates tonight, thousands of innocent souls that will provide more than enough energy to complete the awakening. Your heroic gesture will accomplish nothing except adding your own soul to my collection." But as he spoke, I noticed something that filled me with desperate hope. The children trapped in their crystalline prisons were not passive victims, but active participants in their own rescue attempt. Led by little Lorraine Allison, they had been using their combined spiritual energy to weaken the bonds that held the entity in this reality, their innocent souls creating a kind of holy resonance that made the creature writhe in obvious discomfort. "Now!" Margaret screamed, her voice carrying across dimensions as she and every other passenger who had died on that terrible night in 1912 manifested in the cargo hold, their combined presence creating a blinding light that made the shadow men recoil like vampires from blessed sunlight. What happened in those final moments aboard the ghost ship defied every law of physics, biology, and sanity that I had ever studied, but I will record it here as faithfully as my shattered mind can recall, knowing that these may be the last coherent thoughts I ever have. The blessed blade in my hand grew white hot as I plunged it toward the entity's obsidian heart, and the moment the silver touched that alien surface, reality itself seemed to crack like a broken mirror. The creature's scream was not a sound, but a psychic wave that shattered every piece of glass aboard the phantom Titanic, sent geysers of boiling water erupting through the ship's hull, and made every star in the sky above flicker like candles in a hurricane wind. Blackwood threw himself at me with inhuman speed, his transformed body moving like liquid shadow as he tried to stop the blade from completing its work. But the spirits of the Titanic's passengers formed a protective wall around me, their century of rage and suffering given physical form for the first time since their deaths. Captain Smith grappled with shadow men, whose touch froze the air itself, while Mrs. Strauss and her husband fought back to back against creatures that had crawled up from oceanic trenches that had never known light. The ship's orchestra, led by Wallace Hartley's ghost, played a melody that made the alien geometry of the cargo hold collapse in on itself, their music creating harmony where chaos had reigned supreme. The obsidian heart cracked along hairline fractures that spread like spiderwebs across its surface, and from each fissure poured light that was somehow both beautiful and terrible, the combined essence of every soul the entity had consumed over the centuries, finally free to return to whatever afterlife awaited them. The children in their crystalline cages burst free with cries of joy that made my heart soar even as my sanity crumbled, their innocent laughter providing the final note in a symphony of liberation that sent the old one shrieking back to whatever cosmic void had spawned it. But victory came at a price that I had understood from the moment I first heard the ghostly orchestra playing in these cursed waters. As the entity dissolved into constituent darkness, the ritual circle that had been holding the phantom Titanic in this reality began to collapse, and I felt the crushing weight of 3 miles of ocean pressing down upon us as the supernatural forces that had been defying natural law finally gave way to physics. Margaret Hayes took my hand as the ship began its second and final journey to the ocean floor, her touch surprisingly warm despite her century in the depths. "You have done what we could not," she whispered, her voice now filled with peace instead of the desperate urgency that had driven her for over 100 years. "The cruise ships above will sail safely home, and the old ones will sleep for another eon, perhaps forever. But we cannot return to the world above. We are bound to these waters by forces stronger than death itself. And now, so are you. Take comfort in knowing that your sacrifice has saved millions of lives, and that you will never be alone here in the darkness." As the water closed over my head for the final time, I saw through the portholes of the flooding cargo hold, a sight that made my soul sing with triumph, even as my body prepared for its eternal rest. The cruise ships that had been sailing toward our coordinates were turning away, their crews reporting sudden equipment malfunctions and navigation errors that would keep them far from these haunted waters. The satellite feeds that had been monitoring our expedition went dark, ensuring that the world above would never know how close it had come to cosmic annihilation. Now I write these final words as the phantom Titanic settles once more into her grave on the ocean floor, knowing that they will somehow find their way to the surface, carried by currents, both natural and supernatural, to be discovered by whoever is meant to learn the truth about what really happened on that April night in 1912. The children play in corridors that will never again know sunlight. The passengers dance to music that echoes through eternity, and I have taken my place among them as a guardian of secrets that must never be fully told. If you ever find yourself sailing over the coordinates 41°46 and 49°57 W on a night when the stars align as they did over a century ago, listen carefully to the wind across the waves. You might hear the faint sound of an orchestra playing "Nearer My God to Thee," and if you do, turn your ship around immediately and sail as fast as you can toward any other horizon. For while the old ones sleep once more in their cosmic void, there are other entities waiting in the deepest trenches of the world's oceans, and they are always hungry for the souls of those foolish enough to disturb their ancient slumber. Some secrets are meant to stay buried beneath the waves, and some stories should never be told around campfires where children might hear them and dream of adventures in waters that should forever remain untouched by human hands. But sometimes, when the need is great and the darkness presses close, someone must remember that heroes can be found in the most unlikely places, and that even death is not always the end of the story. The orchestra plays on in the depths, and we dance to music that spans eternity, guardians of a world that will never know how close it came to dancing to a very different tune indeed.